Hello and welcome to the Underhive. We are back with some more How to Command the Death Guard. In this series, we're going to take a look at every aspect of the Death Guard, so whether you're looking to get more out of your army, or you're thinking of joining Nurgle's finest, then there's something here for you. In this episode, we're tackling the topic, should you run Chaos Knights in your Death Guard list? So let's dive in and take a look. The first question to ask is, why would you run Chaos Knights in a list? Now, arguably this comes down more to fun than the sort of competitive quality aspect that they might add, but they bring a few important things that the Death Guard list doesn't really do, in that they bring a massive model. If you bring the larger Chaos Knights, particularly the Tyrant, of course you can run Mortarion, who is a very large model in and of himself, and likelihood is that would be the model you're cutting from your list to put a Chaos Knight in if you are running Mortarion. So it's a big, imposing model. It's good from the hobby perspective. I'm not a great painter or anything, but I enjoy doing the Chaos Knights given they're a large model. So there's a bit of that in there too. But they have some really fun abilities. So they've got the Harbingers of Dread, which doesn't work too dissimilarly to the way the Contagion works. Unlike the Contagion, it has a set 12-inch range, and it gets an added effect of that range throughout the game as the turns progress. So whereas Contagions, the effect is what it is, but the range gets bigger, with Dread, the range is what it is, except for one of the upgrades you can pick to make it a 15-incher. But otherwise, it's 12-inch, and it affects leadership, essentially. So when your opponent is within that Dread range, depending on the options you pick as you move through the turns of the game, your opponent will have to take Dread tests, so they have to roll their leadership or under, but because the default is -1 leadership, effectively they have to roll under their standard leadership. So they have to roll under the leadership, or they can't do perhaps what they wanted to do, halving charge distances, meaning you can't be shot unless you're the closest unit, and otherwise messing with their ability to fight you, or going for things like just -1 to be hit in both ranged and later and in melee as well. So whether you want to just mess with your opponent's ability to make the decisions they want to make, or make your Chaos Knights that bit harder to deal with as the game goes through, the Harbingers of Dread abilities are very fun to play with. On top of that, we've got the Favors of the Dark Gods, which is both as interesting and fun to do as it is to say. Now, I'm not going to run through all of those. I'm going to come back to them in a minute. I'm not going to run through all 15, because why would you be dedicating to any of the gods except Nurgle, and why would you be undivided? We are Nurgle. No, but seriously, you could dedicate them to the other Chaos Gods, but it just doesn't feel that thematic to me to do that. There are some good picks for the other Chaos Gods, but the less we say about, the more pleased Nurgle will be, at least. But before we get into the favours and sort of adding to the Knights, what do they actually do for the list? Now, Chaos Knights are broken down into 3 chassis types. So we've got the War Dogs, we've got the Aberrants, which are the mid-sized Knights, the larger size but not the largest, and then the Tyrant, which is a singular model, which is a Tyrant. Now, the Tyrants for me are probably like the least favourable thing to like go out there and buy as a player, because Games Workshop don't really meet you halfway. You have to go and buy an Imperial Knight and then kit bash it to make it chaosy. Obviously, you don't have to like make a load of tentacles with green stuff and stuff. It's up to you. But to make it actually chaosy, you're going to have to upgrade it with bits and bobs as well, which kind of feels a bit sucky to me from a consumer perspective. So I'm not really a fan of the Tyrant for that. But as a model, I think it's quite cool. It's massive, massive firepower, no melee, so the idea being the Tyrant sits back in your lines and just shoots the hell out of anything daft enough to come out into line of sight. I think the Tyrant compares closest with the likes of several Plague Burst Crawlers and Blight Haulers. The supreme firepower that you get out of it is quite comparable to the amount of firepower you'd get out of a squadron of Plague Burst Crawlers. And of course, the price tag at over 400, 500 points. I think it's over 500 once you've got the weapons on it. It's a significant chunk of the list. So again, it's not overly competitive to do that. I don't see anybody doing that winning tournaments, but it is fun to throw in a tyrant. The Aberrants, you've got a good mix there. The Rampager is a significant melee threat, and there's a lot of wounds to chew through there to try and prevent it getting into your lines. Whenever I've played as or against Chaos Knights, the Rampager has always been the MVP, absolutely going ham on whatever is in front of it, because you've got both the claw and chainsword profiles to use. And realistically, the movement available to the knights, whilst they have issues with terrain blocking them, they've got to go around stuff, but they have got a really significant movement distance at the beginning of the game. So something like a Rampager can be really, really good as just like an alternative to Mortarion, just with the massive melee threat. The Abominant brings you the Psychic option if you wanted to, because of course you're not dedicating it to Khorne. So it's got some decent melee option there, quite good at dealing with elite infantry, can also deal with armor. The Warpstorm Discipline does give it access to some more durability with a 5-up invul, which is 5-up Feel No Pain on top of its built-in 5-up invul against range. So it can hold out with the likes of that. But of course, being a psychic power, it can fail, it can get denied, and at that point, your Abominant is considerably less durable. The Despoiler got a good mix of range and melee there. Not quite as many attacks as the Rampager, but it can still get a lot of work done. And that huge las monstrous cannon on it can really do a number on enemy armor. If you get a good shooting phase off in the first turn, you could definitely expect to get rid of a big monster or vehicle, and then certainly over 2-3 turns, if you're not taking big hits on the Despoiler, then you can do all right with that as well. Is it the Despoiler or Desecrator? I always get confused between those two. Let's check it out just to be sure. Night Despoiler. Okay, so the Night Despoiler is the one that can have the Demon Breath Melter Gun. It will have been the Desecrator I was on about then. Yeah, the Desecrator with the Desecrator Laser Destructor. 72-inch, heavy 2, strength 14, AP -5, damage D3 +6. So yeah, if both those shots get through it, it's going to hurt. And with -5 AP, there isn't much that gets to save against that without an invul. So Night Desecrator can do very well as well, and then the Despoiler, similar sort of score. It can have double melee option, I believe. Yeah, it can have the sword and claw, but I don't know why you would do that when you can just take a Rampager if that's what you want. Now, the issue with throwing... Oh, and the War Dogs, sorry, before we skip on to that. The War Dogs, I would say the Stalkers, whether you're going for, like, double shooting options or whether you go in one shooting, one melee, they closely compare with the Blight Haulers. They're a little bit more expensive than the Blight Haulers, but they do have that additional movement until they get bracketed. So they're more likely to be able to make a turn 1 charge and actually make some impact turn 1, if not turn 2. The Chainsword on there has 2 profiles, so you've got a good option regardless of what you're going into, whereas Blight Haulers only really want to be fighting light infantry ideally, because whilst they can shoot in melee, they don't really have great profiles for dealing with elite infantry in any capacity. The Stalkers can deal with elite infantry with that Chainsword or with the Claw, whichever you prefer. But they are that bit more expensive. So not only are you going to have to cut Blight Haulers out your list, but you're actually going to have to find some extra points as well. The Carnivores, the pure melee War Dog options, I think most closely compare with the likes of Death Shroud in terms of the effect they have on the game. The key difference being the Carnivores typically are going to start on the board, but are going to have that supreme movement to get out there early, whereas the Death Shroud, if they're starting on the board, are going to take a few turns to get where they need to be, and if they're striking in, they can be denied. Infiltrators, whether they be Space Marines or actually, just infiltrator style effects from other factions, can screen out the board really, really well against striking in. And as that's such a big part of the game at the moment, being aware of your opponent's ability to mitigate that is very important, and carnivores don't have that weakness in that they just charge up the board rather than trying to strike in. So yeah, carnivore not a million miles away in point cost from a squad of 3 Death Shroud. I think you could quite easily interchange one of those. So overall, what they're bringing is mostly high strength, high AP, high damage attacks, whether in range or in melee, with far more speed than the equivalent Death Guard units would have until they are bracketed. But the downside is that they are not supported by the rest of the army in any way. Whether you go for a lance of several war dogs or whether you go for just an individual big knight, they are going to live or die on the dice rolls. And, you know, I think that's fair to say of any army in a dice game. If you roll well, you're just going to win. It's better to be lucky than good. But it feels even more so on the knights. It's a very similar feeling to running Plague Burst Crawlers. When you roll a 1 on that mortar shot, it sucks. When you roll a 6, they feel like they're absolute beasts. So if you're fine with that style of play where you don't mind giving up games just by being unlucky in early turns, then the Knights can be a really fun thing to throw in. But consistent, I wouldn't say so. The Knights compensate that in their own list by having some big Knights that buff the War Dogs as well, and lumping stratagems on top of that. Whilst you will have access to the stratagems, you won't have access to enough Knights in a Death Guard list to make the Knight component actually a supported aspect of the army. So as we've said there, in terms of slipping them in, if you've got Mortarion in the list, that's a fairly obvious cut if you want to chuck some Knights in, because whilst they don't support the rest of the Death Guard army in the way Mortarion can, with his Warlord traits, his Chapter Master rerolls, his psychic powers, they do add that big target which should protect the rest of the army to an extent if the opponent is taking the bait and going for the distraction card effects. I would say Mortarion supports the list to a far greater extent than a big knight does, but again, is it more fun to run Mortarion? Arguably not. So as we've said there is a lot of fun to be had, and we can also dedicate these knights to Nurgle. Now, I'm not going to cover every single favour of the Dark Gods here, because, as we've said, we're not going to be dedicating them to Khorne, Slaanesh, or Tzeentch, because we are Nurgle's chosen. There are some good ones in the Undivided as well, but I'm not going to cover them here today. We may well come back to the Chaos Knights as a faction anyway in the future. So as far as the Nurgle ones, so you've got the Putrid Carapace, which gives you, all of these will give you the Nurgle keyword. Couple of important points there. Your own explosions for Nurgle explosions, like Bloat Drones, Blight Haulers, Mortarion, other things, they wouldn't affect your knights now because they've got the Nurgle keyword. So that's a nice side benefit, but it also gives them access to a stratagem that allows them to operate on their top profile. As we've said, one of the biggest weaknesses of Knights is that they're basically just reliant on rolling 3-ups all game. So rolling 1s and 2s always sucks. But with the ability to work on the top profile, at least when you're bracketed and now you're on 5-ups, you can pay the CP to go back down to 3-ups and at least have that bit of extra chance to get attacks through. So we gain the Nurgle keyword. And then each time an attack with a damage characteristic of 1 is allocated to this model, add 1 to any armor saving throws made against that attack. So you go from a standard 3-up save to a 2-up save. Given that obscuring isn't really a thing if you bring in big knights, same as Mortarion, and you won't be getting cover, you may get access to dens from like being on the far side of a wood or something like that, but you're not going to be able to get light from buildings by being a vehicle. So getting the extra save can be pretty relevant. It doesn't seem like that strong an effect because it's only against 1 damage attacks. I think it's more powerful on a Dreadblade where there is just 1 knight rather than in a knight list, because Nurgle blessing me there with some sneezes. So whilst in a normal knight list, where there are a lot of knights to pick from, having just one that has a better save means your opponent's just going to shoot the others instead with those weapons. With only having like one or only like a couple of knights in the list as a Death Guard list, they're not necessarily going to have the option to say, well, I'll ignore that one knight and deal with the others, because that's the one that's in their face going to chainsaw the hell out of them if they don't. Again, most armies will have some element of 1 damage attacks, and it's not something that the Chaos Knights deal with particularly well, because of course they can't reduce the damage off it to like keep a bit of value in the model, and they're on a 3-up save normally. So even if it's no AP, you've still got a 1 in 3 chance of the knight failing the save, and there isn't really many ways they can do anything about that. So not having Armor of Contempt actually makes the knight a juicier target than most of your army against this sort of firepower, whether we're talking small arms like bolters or las, or whether we're talking like Avenger autocannons or Reaper autocannons or whatever it might be. Ultimately, they're either wounding on 5s, if not 4s, into a War Dog, and certainly 5s most of the time against the bigger knights. But even without AP, you're only on a 3-up save normally, so I think this is reasonable. Now, I'll come back to how you unlock the favoured ability in a minute, but you get kills for now. You get kills, and then you unlock a second aspect to each of these. So for the Putrid Carapace, you'd have the additional armour save against damage 1 attacks, and then once you're favoured, the model gains an additional toughness. It's nothing mind-blowing, but it's okay. You know, I think it's a reasonable pick for a bit of flavour. The next one here I think is a little bit more powerful, but not necessarily that much more. So, Blessing of 1,000 Poxes, they gain the Nurgle keyword. Each time this model makes a melee attack, an unmodified hit roll of a 6 automatically wounds the target. Now, not having to make a wound roll is always a buff. It's a 100% guaranteed wound rather than something with an above 0% chance to fail. So, on one hand, yes, that can be good. But on the other hand, the wound roll isn't the bit you really struggle with as knights, it's the hit roll, because that's the bit that you get bracketed on, and that's the bit that's only ever really a 3-up, other than the carnivores and things having 2-ups in melee. So, it's not really needed, is the point. Most of the time you're wounding stuff on 3s, if not 2s. However, in a knight list, like where it's all knights, all big damage all the time, you are quite susceptible to things like transhuman going, well, nope, you only wound us on 4s now rather than 2s, or 4s rather than 3s. Even mini transhuman, which just ignores wounding on 2s from things like Templars and Nids, can have some good game into knights. So even though you're only looking at running a Dreadblade Lance and just, a small amount of knights in a Death Guard list, that can account for the transhuman effect that your opponent might be bringing, or even just like a -1 to wound ability. The favoured ability there is when the model makes a ranged attack, an unmodified hit roll of a 6 always wounds the target. Again, I think the ranged attacks that knights make are always at least strength 8, aside from the Avenger cannon on the Stalkers. But at the bare minimum, we're talking Melter. So again, I don't think you really need that, but it's kind of nice to have when you're in that transhuman matchup. So if you're building a list to go up against a friend that maybe has a lot of transhuman, then you might want to consider that as an option. And then the last one, I think this is the most fun, which is why I've saved it to last, is the Aura of Corruption. You gain the Nurgle keyword, and you also gain an Aura, Corruption of the Body. Whilst the enemy unit is within 6 of this model, subtract 1 from the strength characteristic of models in that unit. -1 strength, it's going to make it a lot harder to hurt you in melee. In melee, you don't have an invuln as your knight. I believe I haven't gone back through all the stratagems since I last read them. You might well be able to get an invuln in melee, but by default, it isn't there. Ultimately, you're not going to be wanting to take much in the way of melee from high strength enemies. Something like a Power Fist, that's taking it down from strength 8 to strength 6, because the Power Fist doubles the strength of the model, and the model strength is going down by 1 from 4 to 3, or whatever it might be. So, against things like Thunderhammers, Power Fists, anything like that doubles your strength, that can be really, really potent, because they are the sorts of melee weapons that your opponent's going to look to use to take apart a knight. But once you're favoured, the model gains the following ability. So this is on top of Corruption of the Body, Corruption of the Soul. Whilst an enemy unit is within 6 inches of this model, subtract 1 from the toughness characteristic of models in that unit. So another similar effect to the Contagions of Nurgle. Now, although the Contagions of Nurgle don't stack on top of each other, this is a separate effect right here, and that does stack. So you can have a bubble where it is -2 toughness if you want to step in and take the Pepsi challenge, which even big NID monsters aren't going to enjoy. You're certainly going to be wounded on 3s at that point against most stuff, if not 2s. So I think very fun and thematic to slip in to a Death Guard list with the Aura of Corruption. Now, the way that those marks work is you can only give it to one knight in the squad. So if we're taking an Aberrant class, then it's just that guy gets the mark, fine. But if we're taking a squad of War Dogs, only the lead War Dog. They don't have like a sergeant or anything, but it's only the first War Dog that can have this mark. So chances are, if you're taking War Dogs, only one of them is going to get this, because it would be awkward to build a list in another way that would allow you to do otherwise. So for me, I think if you're running knights in as a Dreadblade in another army, I think you just go for the big knight and just have fun. Obviously, I would say the War Dogs are better overall, point for point value. Some of the better performing lists that have come out since this codex have been predominantly, if not all, War Dogs. So I think that goes some way to showing that, yes, the War Dogs are strong for what they are, whereas the big knights have those big disadvantages like never being obscured, and as a result don't do as well. But I think in context of just running it in a Death Guard list, I think just chucking a big knight in there is fine. It's not going to be competitive, but it's going to be fun. So with that being said, there's a point cost for each of them. So let me just get those. So the Putrid Carapace with the better save and the additional toughness, 20 points on a War Dog, 40 points on an Aberrant, 60 points on a Tyrant. I think it does all right on a Tyrant, though, to be honest. That's one of the ones that I actually quite like on a Tyrant, because they might have to chip you down with some 1 damage fire, and having a 2-up save against no AP is all right. Blessing of 1,000 Poxes, so that is the auto-wounding one. 15 points on a War Dog, 30 points on an Aberrant, 15 points on a Tyrant, because a Tyrant only gets the benefit once it's favoured anyway. And then Aura of Corruption is 35 on a War Dog, 35 on an Aberrant, and 25 on a Tyrant, because of course the Tyrant isn't likely to be getting up there to get that Aura in range. So I think for 35 points, the Aura of Corruption is all right. So it would take an Abominant up from 430 to 465, puts him in a similar category to Mortarion there, just over. So, to unlock the favoured ability, what you've got to do is kill wounds worth of models. Not deal wounds, kill models that have so ever many wounds. So a War Dog needs to get 5 wounds worth of offering, and an Aberrant needs 10, and a Tyrant needs 15. So, for example, if there's an enemy vehicle, let's say like a Land Raider or something, it's got 14 wounds. Let's say the Abominant deals 12 wounds to it, and then the Death Shroud deal the last 2 and kill it. The Abominant gets nothing. It dealt 12 wounds, but he didn't kill the model. The other way around, if the Death Shroud chip off 3, 4, 5 wounds off it, and then the Aberrant comes in and kills it, it might have only done 9 wounds. It didn't deal 10 wounds, but it killed a model that had more than 10 wounds. So it's instantly favoured. The War Dogs, again, they only need 5, so like they can plink away at some light infantry, maybe chuck a melter shot into a wounded light vehicle, like, like a Astartes attack bike or something like that, and they're already there. So it's quite easy to get the War Dogs favoured, a little bit more difficult on the Aberrant, but you can get it done with a little bit of creative ordering in your shooting phase. You can still get it done fairly early. So by getting that -1 strength, -1 toughness early in the fight, it makes that target like a lot less of a juicy target to come in at with those thunder hammers, those power fists, whatever it might be. And given you've got a -1 damage stratagem for the knights as well, you can mitigate a lot of the damage between having the -1 strength, -1 damage strat, the invuln against range, if we're talking about range, and being able to rotate ion shields for a 4-up invuln against range if you really want to. But also then the ability to interrupt if you've been, multiple charges across the board. Interrupting with a knight is always very strong. It's always something your opponent's got to consider about their placement. And also with the spell, not Spike Squall. Spike Squall's damage. But the spell for the 5-up invuln is very tasty indeed. I will just read that to you briefly. Warpstorm Discipline. Winds of the Warp. To Blessing. Warp charge value of 6. Until the start of the next psychic phase, each time this psyker would lose a wound, roll a d6 on a 5-ups not lost. And if the test was more than 8 or 8 or more, war dogs within 6 of the psyker get a 6-up feel no pain as well. You're unlikely to run an Aberrant and several War Dogs in a Death Guard list. It starts to become a Chaos Knight list with some Death Guard at that stage. But the 5-up invuln on the Aberrant, the turns that you can, is very, very nice indeed, which means you're running an Abominant or you're running something and dedicating it to Zinch, which is dirty, so don't do that. No, you can if you want to, though. So that's my take on it. I think they're fun. I'm painting some up at the minute, bit by bit. When I get the chance, because I want to use them exactly as I've just described. Do I think it's particularly competitive? No. Do I think it's fun? Hella yes. You can have some really good narrative games by just throwing a knight in. Even if you wanted to throw in like a wandering knight onto the battlefield that'll just, each of you take turns using it to attack the opponent. Having an extra model like that is pretty fun for games like that. So either way around, I think they are worth having just a small contingent of, just to use occasionally. But unless you're going for like a big knight army as well, then it's not something you'd necessarily want to lean into as an addition to a Death Guard force. I think you're almost always going to be better off with some Playburst Crawlers, some Blight Haulers, some more Death Shroud, a Mortarion, some more supporting characters. Whatever it might be, you can go with pretty much anything in the Death Guard Codex, and you're going to end up with more cohesion, more consistency, and perhaps a more competitive outcome almost all of the time. So that's everything for me on the Chaos Knights. I'd love to hear your opinion. I am still going to be playing them from time to time in my Death Guard, but I just don't expect to win those games. So I'd love to hear what you think. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time in the Underhive.